don't you know? Oh, can't you see? Can't you tell, baby?
And this photo of a semi-palmated plover. Wait a second, let me fix the pictures here on the right so I can see the screen too. Okay, this was taken by my brother Ken Schneider, as are most of the photos in this PowerPoint. And he is a Bay Area birder. Some of you might even know him. So much of what I'm going to be talking about today is in my book on learning principles for the public, things like positive reinforcement, and there's a lot more to it, believe me, that I specialized in, its role in nature-nurture relations, as you can see from the subtitle, and its applications, but just a lot about how learning principles work, and that certainly applies to birds as well. And I have a number of bird examples in the book, including this one from ornithologist Russ Wald about 15 years ago now. And he was in the Southwest looking out on his backyard, and he had a big tray feeder, and a crow was dominating it. And a Steller's jay kept on trying to get in there and get some seeds without success. And before his very eyes, the Steller's jay then landed on a shrub in his backyard and broke off about a 4-inch twig and flew back to the feeder and lunged at the crow with this weapon, this 4-inch long twig pointed at the crow, and the crow jumped back. However, crows are a lot bigger than Steller's jays, and so the crow then moved forward again in a threatening way, and the jay dropped the twig and jumped back, upon which the crow picked up the twig and lunged at the jay. You cannot make these things up. So obviously we have a lot of sophisticated behavior there, and learning in action and tool use, which I'm going to be discussing later. And this is all immortalized in the Wilson Journal of Ornithology there. We all see learning in wild birds really more frequently than we realize. I have a water-wise yard here in Stockton with a lot of native plants, but it came with a redwood. So I have a redwood where my local scrub jays like to nest. And so many summers then, I get the young fledglings in my yard, birds like this, trying to figure out how to make a living, squawking for their parents to feed them, but also flipping things over and picking this up, picking that up in my backyard. Is this edible? Is that edible? You can see learning going on. They're figuring out what's good to eat, what's not, and where do you find it. And every winter, I have a lot of white-crowned sparrows in my yard. Sometimes I put out suet feeders. This is not something that most white-crowned sparrows ever figure out how to handle, but most winters, I have at least one or two that do learn that suet is good to eat. And if you fly up there and peck at it, you get way ahead of all your friends there on the ground, just trying to get scraps from the other feeders, right? So learning in action. And one of my friends in Seattle has had amazing variety of species at her suet feeder. I wish we were in person, because then I could ask you what you've been getting, but maybe put it in the chat. She gets spotted towhees at her suet feeder, bush tits, and ruby-crowned kinglets. And hey, I have bush tits and ruby-crowned kinglets in my yard, kinglets in the winter, of course, and they never ever come to my suet feeder. So I don't know what's going on there, but hers have learned. Her bush tits, believe it or not, even eat peanuts, which I think is awesome. And she has berry thrushes in the winter in Seattle, and some of them learn to eat suet too. So learning is very flexible. Birds can do it, and you do get these pretty surprising outcomes sometimes, and more to come. So here's what we're going to be discussing. And let's start with the basics then. If you are not able to learn from consequences, then you're in trouble, because if you do something rewarding, like you find some food and you can't repeat whatever behavior produced that then. In other words, you don't have the neurophysiological connection association, that's necessary, then, you're missing out. Likewise, if you do something that causes harm, then it would be really handy to be able to associate that behavior with that negative consequence and avoid doing it, right? And so it may be not all that surprising then that even very simple multicellular organisms like this planarian worm are capable of learning from consequences. That's technically operant learning. So if they do something that produces something beneficial, that's a reinforcer, and they will learn to make that association and do it again. Not surprisingly, then, all vertebrates have this basic ability, including birds. And it's funny to see in very young birds how it's kind of like with human babies when they are trying to peck at food. The ability to peck is not learned. That's kind of an instinctive, innate capability. It's still a product of environment as well as genes, because nature and nurture always work together, but it's not a learned ability. However, the ability to peck at a particular piece of food where you have to have the beak-eye coordination, that very definitely is learned. This is a baby avocet, by the way, and you can see it just in baby chicken chicks. They're ludicrously bad at that at first, but very quickly they learn how to peck accurately at a target. And it's like with human infants, when you put like a mobile or something in front of them that they want to grab, and they're moving their hands around, but you think it would be easy, but it's not. It's something that has to be learned for us too. And some very unusual consequences can serve as very effective reinforcers. You might think that only humans can appreciate sunsets, but you would be wrong. Over a century ago, a German zoologist documented an older chimpanzee out in the wild, or else actually it might have been in an enclosure in like a captive breeding kind of situation. Anyway, some fairly open area where he would go to a particular observation point when there was a good sunset. He would watch it till it would start to fade, and only then would he go back to where he would be sleeping for the night. Pretty cool. Some of you can probably testify as to the effectiveness of something about various TV programs that works for dogs. It'd be fun to discuss that too at some point, but clearly that can serve as an effective reinforcer, something about it. And in a proper study, a species called the Java sparrow was documented to prefer melodic music over dissonant 20th century classical music, a very human preference. And they enjoyed listening to the melodic music. It was reinforcing. The basis for this, of course, in the brain is the pleasure centers. There's more than one. We saw how very simple planaria, very simple form of multicellular life, already have the capability of learning from consequences. So no surprise, even invertebrates like snails have these. And of course, birds do as well. Now, the relationship between behavior and consequences can be extremely complex. But sometimes it's fairly simple too, such as when you look out the window and there's a nice view that's rewarding. So then you look out the window again. And every time that you turn your head to look out the window, you're rewarded with the view. It's a one-to-one relationship. Most relationships are a lot more complex, more like reading the newspaper for those of us who still do that. A lot of us electronically now, right? But not every story is reinforcing. But as you look through, maybe you turn the page and there's another good one. Maybe you have to go through a couple of columns until you find another one. It's a variable schedule of reinforcement, but the very next turn of the page might bring you a really interesting story. And so variable schedules of reinforcement are actually powerfully motivating. They're the ones behind gambling. And what's really cool here is that different animal species across all vertebrates, certainly, including birds, they have the same kind of behavioral patterns on different schedules of reinforcement than people do. Likewise, when we're making choices, say you have a choice between two different behaviors, like in this study, we're looking at rats here, but I'm going to bring in birds in just a sec. So the rats here are working to get yummy food pellets. The people are working for points. And the idea here is that choices track consequences, so that if, let's say, the left side is paying off more frequently than the right side, or the left side has a bigger reinforcer or a higher quality consequence, then that's what you're going to go with more often, right? So we should see choices track consequences. In this study, the same kind of setup for the humans and for the rats, and it was variable schedules and different variable schedules on one side compared to the other. And you can see on the x-axis, the proportion on the left side that gets reinforced, increasing as you go up here. All right, there we go. And then on the y-axis, the proportion of behaviors on that side. And no surprise, as the proportion of reinforcers increases, so does the proportion of responses. We see, in fact, the same kind of mathematical equation accounting for this practically identical choice behavior for people and for rats, and for birds too. And I like to use this example because this is wild birds in the wild, just their natural foraging. Now, this is a species that's found in the United States, but mainly in Alaska. Occasionally we get one or two down as far as California, more often in like Washington State. And they can forage with their flock, or some of them hold territories along waterways, like in the illustration on the right there. And the longer you wait, the more likely something juicy is washed up in your territory. So these birds fly back and forth and spend different amounts of time foraging with the flock versus foraging on their territory. And that's what the researcher tracked then, as well as the reinforcement rate that they were getting. So here we're looking at time ratios rather than behavior ratios, but it's the same kind of relationship here. Not surprisingly, you know, when the flock is foraging in a really rich area, then you're more likely to stay and spend a lot of time there. If they're not doing very well, then you go back and spend more time on your territory, right? So once again, choices track consequences. And there are often signals telling us how likely it is that a behavior is going to be able to be rewarded or not. And for birders, one signal that we all learn, certainly experienced birders, is that when there's a bunch of crows or jays raising a ruckus and mobbing something hidden in a conifer, that we should stop and check, because we might be reinforced by, and this is a long-eared owl. And after I moved to Stockton about a dozen years ago, Jim Rouse, who some of you may know, was leading the field trip to Lodi Lake Nature Preserve, which some of you know, that's one of our top spots in San Joaquin County. And this happened, and fortunately I had my scope with me, because Jim was able to find two long-eared owls. It was really exciting. Well, guess what? Birds learn signals too. And this is a kind of cool example where a pair of osprey were nesting right near where a family had their property, and it was on a waterway, hence the osprey nest, and they had a pier with a boat. And when they went out on the pier, it was kind of close to where the ospreys were nesting. The ospreys would get upset. So the ospreys learned a very interesting signal here, because sometimes the people would just go out in their backyard. They wouldn't be taking the boat out, right? But whenever they took the boat out, they wore their boat boots. Their boat boots, probably not the right term, that's what I'm going to call them, right? And the ospreys learned that when the people were not wearing boots, then they didn't have to worry. But as soon as someone came out in the backyard, even when they're not anywhere near the pier, they learn that signal that their nesting territory was about to be encroached upon with the boots there. And so they got upset, they would fly out, they would be squawking, you know, they'd be, letting everyone know that, that they were unhappy about these people going out to their boat and getting too close to the nest. And there's been a number of really interesting studies about this. This one I like because it took place with wild mockingbirds, 24 females who were incubating on the University of Florida campus in Gainesville. And the researchers wanted to see if the mockingbirds learned the difference between individual people. So they had one person, assigned to, say, a particular group of nests, and the person would start out from a set distance. And meanwhile, there's other people walking around. It's a campus, right? So there's other people around, but this person would start at a set distance and then walk up to within 3 feet of the nest, stop, and then lift up their hands and reach out so that they were almost touching the nest if it was down low enough, or, getting closer anyway. And that's what they did for 4 days in a row. And the researchers monitored the reactions of these mockingbirds. And again, 24 mockingbirds, so these data are averaged over the 24. And at the top here, you can see the distance it took for the incubating birds to fly away when this person got closer. And the people changed their clothing each day, so that could not be a signal. But of course, not only just their facial features, this was before COVID, so they weren't wearing masks, right? But it could have been also, their size, the way they walk, stuff like that too. Although other researchers found in labs that crows and pigeons can distinguish human faces quite accurately. They have good vision, right? Anyway, back to the flush distance here, then you can see by the 3rd day that these birds have learned that that individual is trouble, and that they're flushing when the person is a lot further away than on the 1st day. Same thing with the alarm calls and the number of attacks here, especially on the 4th day. And then the real clincher here, on the 5th day, someone else, a different person, did the exact same behaviors. And you can see that the mockingbirds can tell clearly this is someone different, because we're back to where we were on day 1. Mockingbirds know who we are. So cool. And one of my friends and colleagues who taught at Reed College for many years, Alan Nuringer, did this study some years ago, knowing that pigeons could hear pretty well. And so wondering if they could learn the difference between different styles of classical music. So he taught them with some sample excerpts to peck left when they heard excerpts from the Baroque era. That's like Bach. That's like the early 1700s, for those of you who aren't classical music fans. And then on the other hand, they should peck on the right-hand side and get periodically reinforced with access to grain if they heard music from the 20th century, like Stravinsky, 20th century classical music. Those of you who know music know those are very different styles. And the pigeons figured this out pretty quickly with these training excerpts. So then the researchers played 6 novel excerpts, 3 from the Baroque era, 3 from 20th century. And would they generalize in the way that people do, so that they would categorize them the way that people do? And, peck left for Baroque and right for 20th century. And they didn't get food for these novel excerpts, right? But it was a variable schedule. So, and the answer was for 5 out of the 6, yes, the pigeons categorized the new musical excerpts the same way that people do. So cool. So some years later, a Japanese researcher thought, well, pigeons can see a lot better than people can. Most birds have significantly better visual acuity than we do. So why not try them out on artwork and peck left for Monet and right for Picasso? Yeah, this is really, really hysterical. And indeed, with the training samples, the birds got accurate very quickly. then again, 6 new samples, you know, 3 Picassos, 3 Monets, and they were really good at that. So the researchers thought, we'll make this harder. We'll present some new examples. You know, Monet and Picasso both did a lot of paintings. There's no shortage of samples here. And this time they presented the new samples upside down. It threw off Monet, but not Picasso. Yeah, pretty hysterical. So how does all this interact with instincts? And again, repeating that instincts are still the product of nature and nurture working together, but they're not learned. And it turns out that something like all these behaviors involve a lot of learning, especially for these birds like these hawks. There's certainly an instinctive innate feature of learning to fly. But if you ever watch a large bird in particular on its first flight, it is not a pretty thing to see. Young birds on their first flights have been known to fly into objects. Yeah, and the same thing with parenting. A lot of research has shown that birds across all the different families are not very likely to be successful when they're doing it for the first time. There's a very clear learning effect. The older, more experienced parents are much more likely to raise a brood successfully or to have more fledglings, you know. And the same thing with hunting. Young red tails who are observed learning to hunt will do things like tackle prey that are too large for them, like an adult rabbit, for example. I read about this, that one young red-tailed hawk tried to capture an adult rabbit and very quickly was disabused of that notion that that was going to work. Yeah. However, experienced adult red-tails are able to prey upon rabbits, but it's because of this learning process that they go through, what works, what doesn't, honing their skills over time. Migration is an especially fascinating case because we have the same problem for quite a number of different families of birds, and they've solved it in different ways, what evolution has produced. So that these Ross's geese, their migration is mainly learned. It's not to say there's no instinctive component, but it's very clearly mainly learned. And that's the case for other waterfowl as well, and also for the sandhill cranes that winter near me in San Joaquin County. However, small songbirds, it's just the opposite. It's not to say that there's no learned component, but it's clearly mainly instinctive, and there's a lot of research looking into all these factors. We can also see these dynamics in play with hawks at Cape May, because that's on a peninsula there in New Jersey on the East Coast, sticks out. And so they have a higher proportion of immature hawks, juvenile hawks, on their first southward migration in the fall than you would otherwise expect. And that's because, you know, things like buteos that rely more on thermals and things and that go over land, they learn that it's a real waste of effort to go follow the coast along Cape May because it's a peninsula, they go out and then they come back in, right? So the adult birds, the experienced ones who've been through several migrations, learn just to cut across the peninsula, and they don't see nearly as many of them at the point then because they learn. And for the starlings, again, kind of just the opposite. This study I'm going to describe was mentioned in Scott Weidensaul's first wonderful book on migration, came out about 20 years ago now, I think, Living on the Wind. He has a new book out just this year, which I'm really looking forward to, got good reviews, updating migration. And he is going to be the keynote speaker at the Central Valley Birding Symposium in Stockton in November for anyone who's interested. I've actually met him because I was at one of his talks when I was in the eastern half of the country. So he's a really great writer and researcher. So he talked about a classic study done with starlings in Northern Europe back in the 1950s, I think it was. And they banded over 10,000 starlings. And this was in late summer, like early fall, not that long before they were going to migrate. And they banded juveniles and adults alike and stuck them in containers and trucked them down where they couldn't see anything, 400 miles, and then released them to see what would happen to their migration. And the adult starlings were mainly able to correct for this disruption and end up at their normal wintering grounds. Not all of them. Some of them went 400 miles further south, but most of the adults were experienced and had learned, you know, again, songbirds, mostly it's instinctive and unlearned, but there's room for learning there too. There's flexibility. And so most of them ended up at the right spot. That first year, the juveniles, almost all, ended up 400 miles south of where they were supposed to be. Because they have this ability to know the direction they're supposed to go and to know about how far they should go. So really not surprising that that should happen. What was really especially interesting, I think, is the second winter when the researchers were able to show that there was this split where some of the juveniles still went to that first wintering grounds that was 400 miles south of where they were supposed to be for their group, right? But others were able to learn and modify their migration route, and they ended up with the adults where they were supposed to be in the first place, the normal wintering grounds. So again, it shows how complex it is and also how much flexibility is possible because of the learning capability. So let's look at another great example where learning and instincts interact, and there's a surprising degree of flexibility. In songbird song, we've long known, again, that there's both components. This is a Bengalese finch, and this is one representative graph of results for one of 11 birds. And these were males, and the study was done in acoustically isolated cages during the breeding season. So they would just naturally be singing hundreds of times per day. So the data are by day. So each data point represents the average for hundreds of songs. And the song of this species is like a series of trills on different pitches. So they had this set up, this is in the journal Nature, really, you know, top journal. They had this set up so the equipment could automatically detect when a song started, and then when a target note was sung, and that was one of the beginning notes of the series of trills. And this is frequency or pitch on the y-axis here, and the normal pitch range for this target note was this gray area here, right? And you can see during the baseline period that in fact, most of the pitches for that note are in that expected range. So then we have the first intervention here, the red one here, as immediately as possible. It was like 20 milliseconds. After that note was sung, if it was in the normal range, then the equipment played a loud burst of unpleasant white noise. And the only way the birds could avoid that is if they sang the pitch of that note in a lower range below the gray area here. And you can see already by the first day, you know, they're getting it. And then the other 3 days in that phase, that they're reliably lower. So they learn to modify the pitch of that note. And then very quickly, we're back to baseline here, the black area here. Okay, where's my cursor? There we go. Okay, and then in the second red phase here, we do the same thing as in the first one, but there's 100 millisecond delay. And that may not sound like much, but it's long enough. You know how birdsong goes, right? It trips along here. So by the time that the unpleasant white noise sounds, the birds are far enough along in the song that they never make the connection that they could avoid it by decreasing the pitch of that same note, right? And so they end up just having to listen to the white noise a lot, and there's no change in the pitch of that note. Then we go back to baseline here. Then we do the same thing again, but this time they have to go up to avoid the white noise, and they do. And the sensitivity is just exquisite of this behavior to the consequence. And most of the birds had data that looked like this. And what I think is especially cool is that they were so sensitive that the only pitch that changed in the song for these birds was that one note. The rest of the song was unaffected. Only that one note went down or up in pitch. Just really, really amazing. This is useful that birds are able to be flexible with their songs around noisy nesting areas, because researchers have long documented then that birds have to sing louder to hear each other, warn off rival males nearby, attract females, etc. And they do. When they're in a noisy area, they sing louder than birds that are not, because they've learned. Okay, and this is kind of a cool example too. This one with a more eastern bird. Okay, we get a few here, but not many. Swamp sparrows, and the results here are for 8 females averaged. And swamp sparrows have a trill on one note that is the song, but it can vary in the pitch. You can have higher pitches or lower pitches. It stays generally on one pitch, and it varies in the speed of the trill, kind of like junco songs do, right? And so there are local dialects, and at the top we're looking at an instinctive behavior in the females during the breeding season when they hear a song they like. It's a releasing stimulus for this instinct of a solicitation display where they spread their wings a bit and flare their tail and indicate they're ready to be mounted, basically ready to mate. And on the left we have averaged over these females the number of solicitation displays for the local dialect, and on the right a more distant dialect, and you can see there's a big difference, right? And this, of course, is learned. This is not genetic. There's a strong learning component there, because that's what they hear, right, when they're growing up. And on the bottom here, we have an operant behavior, a learned behavior, and that's hopping about on different perches in their cages. And the researchers set it up so that one perch would play their local dialect song when landed on, and the other would play the more distant dialect to compare the reinforcing value. Because if they enjoy the song and want to hear it more, then they will hop more on that perch. And you can see, in fact, that they do, just as more solicitation displays occurred to the local dialect is also significantly more reinforcing than the more distant dialects. And we see this quite frequently, this relationship between the instinct and the learned behavior, that there's this correlation between the two, which I think is really fascinating. Okay, so like I said, there's a lot of learning involved in songbird song along with the instinctive component. So things sometimes go wrong out in the field, and this would be a great thing for us to discuss in the Q&A, and I'm going to ask for if there's questions soon on the first 2 sections before we do the last section. But I've been fortunate in the field twice in my birding career to see this in action. And the first time I was on my own, unfortunately, and I heard what sounded like a perfectly normal common yellowthroat song, the witchety, 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 but it didn't seem like it was coming from the right habitat. And I tracked down the singer, and it was an indigo bunting, for those of you who know your eastern birds. Yeah, this is not a mockingbird. This is not a bird where you would expect imitation. And you can get them in similar habitats, though. So this is one of those cases where the flexibility and the learning component went wrong. And the second time this happened to me, I was with the graduate student in ornithology and behavior in the eastern half of the country, again, Indiana, actually. This is a field sparrow. And I heard what sounded very much like a field sparrow song, which is on one pitch and which speeds up quite rapidly toward the end. For those of you who've been in the East, you know what I'm talking about. Kind of like a little bit like a rented, but different sound quality. And again, it didn't seem quite right to me. So I tracked down the singer, and once again, it was something different. And again, in a totally different family, just like with the bunting. It was a prairie warbler. Yeah. Again, totally different family. Prairie warblers, however, do share somewhat similar habitats with field sparrows. And their song does speed up a bit, but not as much. And the prairie warbler proper song goes up in pitch, which this one did not for the field sparrow, right? And it also has a raspy quality that was missing. I mean, it really did sound like a field sparrow. And so we were able to get that recorded. It is in the Macaulay Library. It was just really cool. And again, shows you the way that these systems work with nature and nurture and flexibility. And sometimes things go awry. And so let me pause there to ask if there's any questions at this point before we do the third and final portion. And I cannot see the chat, by the way.
If you have a question of
Yeah.
Susan, you can go to the chat button and post it there.
Or unmute, right?
Or unmute. Yep, you can do the unmute and just ask your question at that point.
This is Carrie. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
I have a question. It's just what you were just talking about, like about the field sparrows and the warbler and the indigo bunting. Why do you think those birds pick those other birds' songs up?
Right. The only speculation that I've seen in the literature is it's just what you would expect from, just common sense, right? That there was probably a very loud male indigo, common yellow-throated or field sparrow near these prairie warbler and indigo buntings, and that it overshadowed, the normal input from hearing their own species and whatever instinctive preference there is. And so that's why. And in fact, in lab studies, when the white-crowned sparrows are raised with, okay, what species was it? Hang on a second, I've got it here. Song sparrow. When you have young male white-crowned sparrows raised with song sparrows, male song sparrows that are singing, then sometimes you do still get the normal white-crowned song, but sometimes the adult white-crowned sparrows will sing what sounds just like a normal song sparrow song. And so why is it that it takes in some cases and not in others? I mean, we have to look at it more in detail, but they've shown this in the lab, as well as there being quite a number of examples in the field now. So just pretty fascinating, huh?
Amazing. Thank you.
Any other questions, or shall I go on?
Why don't you proceed, Susan?
Okay, will do. Okay, some birds are capable of pretty amazing feats of memory, and one of them is our very own scrub jay that we know and love. And in one lab study, young scrub jays were the topic of research looking at the degree of learning in their ability to remember what they have cached. And in particular, looking at nuts, which are not perishable, and waxworms, which are. So if you store a waxworm, you better get back to it pretty quickly or else it will rot on you, right? Okay, so is this something that they know instinctively or that they have to learn? And by the way, they often do not come back to things that they cache, right? I have little valley oaks in my backyard coming up, even though there's no valley oaks that close to me, because the scrub jays, cache them and then never come back to eat them. They're not perfect with their memory. But still, what about this question of the waxworms versus the nuts? And with one group, the researchers artificially replaced the waxworms with fresh ones whenever they would start to go bad. And so there was no difference in when those young birds went back to check on the waxworms versus the nuts, indicating, yep, there's no instinctive knowledge there, that you have to come back sooner for the waxworms. But for the ones that they just let the waxworms decay, yeah, at first they were letting them decay. They were waiting too long, and only after enough learning experience did that group of scrub jays modify their behavior accordingly. So when they were given things to cache, and then later on given the chance to go back, they would go back to the waxworms first because they had learned that otherwise they would go bad. So it was very clearly a learning component there. Again, learning and instinct interacting there. In birds like scrub jays that do that, the hippocampus, which is one of the basis of spatial memory in the brain, is larger proportionally because of this ability, right? Evolution has brought that about. But the family of birds with the largest hippocampus proportionally is not one that does caching. And think about it, and again, if we were in person, I could ask you, but I'll just ask you to think about it. What family that might be that has to do a lot with spatial memory, and in this case with time as well. And it may be a surprise. Hummingbirds have to learn the location of all kinds of different flowers. And then of course, flowers are always fading, and then there's new ones you have to learn. And on top of that, each flower has a schedule of reinforcement because you have to wait a certain amount of time till you come back until the nectar has been renewed, right? So that's why the hummingbird family has the highest proportion of the brain as hippocampus, because it's really quite a feat of learning and memory both. This is called transitive inference, where if Lucy is taller than Jim and Jim is taller than Bob, then you know automatically that Lucy is taller than Bob, right? Because of the relationships. And you can generalize from learning these individual relationships really pretty readily. Psychologists years ago used to think this was challenging. Well, even fish can do it if you look at the bottom there. So not surprising that quite a variety of birds have been shown to be capable of it as well. What about tool using? Well, we've actually known for a long time that birds are capable of doing that from Darwin. This is a Galapagos woodpecker finch. And again, no natural woodpeckers there. So the finches that radiated out to be selected by evolution for all these different niches, one learned to use tools like twigs to poke into crevices and tree trunks to get at grubs and things like that, filling that woodpecker niche. And one of the most amazing examples these days is these New Caledonian crows. And this is a parent bird who was modeling the use of a tool for a juvenile. And it's been shown that the juveniles do learn through observing, but this is definitely not imitation, otherwise they would pick it up faster. It's a very difficult skill. They use different tools for different kinds of nooks and crannies. They make tools and modify them, as well as just using twigs and things that are around naturally. And even after 6 months of watching the adults model tool use, most of the young birds still cannot use a tool with any success. They have to be about a year old after a heck of a lot of learning and a heck of a lot of observing until at that point they can be called tool users. They are still not adept though. It will still take even longer for them to become as skilled as their parents. And a totally different example of tool use is bait fishing in herons, which is one of my favorites. And this article at the bottom there, anyone who's interested, has a great review around the world. And in this case, it's just a few individuals of these species who are in the right kind of learning circumstance where they learn that, like if you're in a park where people throw bread for the ducks, that fish are attracted to the bread. And so if you stay near the bread, then, or if you move the bread closer to you, then you wait around and the fish will come. So it's a different kind of tool use. And I have a video I am going to show here now. Let's hope this works. Usually it does. Okay, there we go. And I'm just going to show you a portion of this. This is a green heron in the Caribbean. And this was a well-known bird that was like a tourist attraction. Okay, let's wait for that to load. And there's no audio. And again, so this was a very experienced bird. Oh boy. And if it doesn't load, I could just give you a play-by-play, I guess, but it really is fun to watch. I could certainly share it with you afterwards. Boy, yeah, when I did this for the Morro Bay group about a week and a half ago, it didn't take this long. Our connection may not be quite good enough. Darn. Ugh. Well, let's just give it a few more seconds. And again, I'm happy to share it afterwards. Oh, let's see. Is it working here? Nope. All right, one more try. It really is cool. There we go. Okay, good. We got it. I hope everyone can see it okay. Okay, so here you see again, very experienced bird. And at about the 1 minute point on the video, I've got it at the 40 seconds now. You're going to see the bird be successful. And this bird is a very active fisher. Let's try this piece of bread. Maybe the fish will like that better. I do not get tired of watching this. And there we have success. There you go. All right, and then we stop it now. Okay, good. And in the lab, as well as in the wild, these New Caledonian crows have been shown to make tools as well as use them. And ravens, again, members of the corvid family on the upper right there, have been able to solve this problem where you've got a piece of meat dangling from a piece of string. And if they have a background of manipulating objects, then they're able to generalize that so that they pull up on the string and hold it and then eventually reach the meat that way. You do not have to be a corvid, though, to be capable of sophisticated learning, because you know that string and the meat trick. The chickadee family can do that. Yeah, this is a great tit in the chickadee family in Europe, and they are able to solve that very same problem that the ravens do. So there. And then parrots, of course, yeah, just wonderfully flexible learning capabilities, you know, talking ability and all that, problem solving. And they use tools such as sticks, if they have the appropriate kind of learning history, right? To be able to move something that's farther away from them, closer to them, so that they can reach it and eat it. Things like that. It's a whole fascinating area of research, really. And learning through observing, then, going back to that element of tool use, like for the New Caledonian crows, this is my favorite lab study on that, showing how it works with the humble pigeon. In this study, a model pigeon was trained to peck through a paper cover on an opaque, colorful container to get grain at the bottom. So there's 4 groups of 5 learner pigeons each who are presented with this problem. And 2 results shown here, averaged for the 5 pigeons in each group. And the red group gets to observe the full Monty, okay, gets to watch the model pigeon doing everything. And latency here is how long it takes for them to solve the problem and peck through the container themselves so that they could get to the grain individually, right? And you can see by the 3rd trial here, there we go, that already most of them have it. The yellow group got to watch the model pigeon eating the grain from that container, but not pecking through the paper cover. And they still get it, as you can see, but it takes them substantially longer. Okay, the 3rd group didn't get to see anything, and they got absolutely nowhere. They just sat in there with the covered container and said, okay, when is something going to happen here, right? And the 4th group, in some ways, was the most interesting because they got to watch the model pigeon pecking through the paper cover, but not eating. And they didn't do any better than the group that didn't get to see anything. So seeing the eating is basically a signal, you know, and you can see how they learn that in the wild too, that if you see another bird eating, you learn that's a signal that there's food there. And in fact, all of the groups of the pigeons in the study had to be hungry in order for any learning from observing to happen. If they weren't hungry, why even bother to observe what the other pigeon is doing, right? So it shows how all these factors kind of fit together. And we see the results of learning through observing. We do as birders out in the field pretty often, because turkey vultures do this. Unlike flies that all end up at a carcass because they're following the odor, when turkey vultures are up there circling in the sky, they're watching each other. And if a neighbor suddenly starts heading down, then the ones near it may follow, because they've learned that's a signal that there may be a nice juicy carcass at the end, right? And pretty fun. And learning through observing, obviously, again, important, not just with the New Caledonian crow parents, but with all parents of birds, modeling how you forage for a living. And oyster catchers have a real challenge there. Although some oyster catcher parents just go after worms and not shellfish, so their young birds, follow them, and they benefit from observing. That's a pretty easy skill, and so they're on their own pretty quickly. But then there's two groups of oyster catcher parents who do catch and eat shellfish, and one group eats the shellfish by the brute force method. So they pry them off and grab them and knock them against the rock until they can reach in and eat. And those young take longer to learn. And again, it's not true imitation, otherwise they would pick it up a lot faster. It takes weeks, but they do learn, and observing helps, and they're able to pick that up. And longest of all is the finesse group, where they wait until the shell is slightly open, and then they learn to stick their beaks in and clip that muscle that's holding it closed. And that's the finesse approach. And that takes a lot of skill, a lot of learning. And in fact, sometimes these oyster catchers get stuck with their beaks, closed in the shellfish, and are in big trouble at that point. So those young have to stay with their parents for a long time, but eventually pick that up. And we have learning through observing with foraging in red-winged blackbirds and rails like this king rail that has been documented, presumably in our ridgeways rails and other rails too. In the humble house sparrow, yes, they too are capable of learning through observing. So we've been able to use knowledge of learning principles to help endangered species. For example, whooping cranes had to learn to migrate just like those Ross's geese I showed you earlier. So how do you reestablish a new migration route when there's no older birds to show you the way? Ultralights, that's the answer. And of course, these have been featured in documentaries now, but really cool. You reinforce the birds for following the ultralight, and then that has been successful. And then these endangered species, the ravens were eating the least turned eggs, unfortunately. And so researchers put out fake eggs in that colony that had been dosed with a mild poison, so that when the ravens ate those eggs, they got mildly sick. They had upchuck. It didn't hurt them, but they learned to stay away from the least turn eggs. So taking advantage of consequences there to help the terns, and the same thing with the marbled merlets. And California condors, when they first started to be released after the captive breeding program, a lot of the young died because they got electrocuted on power lines. So they put in the fake power lines that look like the real thing into their training enclosure before they were released, and had to give them a shock so that they could learn to avoid the power lines once they got released, and that was successful. In a more positive mode, watching how parents teach young hawks how to hunt has helped us with captive breeding programs for endangered species teach young hawks how to hunt, reinforcing progressions as they become skilled and are able to handle more difficult prey. And then the northern bald ibis used to be a common breeder in Europe, but they've been extinct in Europe for 300 years. So there were captive breeding programs at zoos, and in one zoo, the bald ibis were not breeding. And this was a problem. And they introduced a positive reinforcement program. This is endorsed by the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, using techniques from learning principles, but positive ones. And suddenly the ibis were less stressed. They stopped running away whenever a keeper would come near, and they started breeding. And then the young, you could follow all the standard techniques and release them into the wild. This has now been done. We have the same problem there, like with the cranes and the waterfowl. Okay, now how do you get them to migrate away from Europe and further south in the winter? And once again, ultralights to the rescue. There is now, for the first time in centuries, a breeding population of bald ibis in Europe again. Yay. So the real question is whether people can learn enough to save ourselves and the birds. This is an invasive species, and Ailanthus. It's a huge problem in the Central Valley, maybe where you are too. It's a tree of not heaven. And of course, habitat destruction, pollution, including climate change, which is what I've been working on since 2017. You know, learning principles so we can learn to take more climate action faster, really critical for the birds as well as for ourselves. This is a picture from one of these recent California fires. However, there certainly is hope, and the California condors are an expiring example of that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. Susan, I have a question, if you can hear me on. Between male and females, and different, have they done studies as to whether one has a more propensity to use tools than the other in any species?
No, I think generally it's pretty similar, although in some species, you know, the males and females occupy somewhat different niches. Like on the wintering grounds, I know that's been established, but probably not on the breeding grounds though. But in general, not that I've seen. It's an interesting question, though, right? In a monkey troop on an island, there's a famous example where they were given sweet potato slices in the sand, and a young female monkey was the first to figure out how to wash the sweet potatoes, so you didn't have to deal with the sand, right? And then that spread first to all the other youngsters, and then to the adult females, and finally to the adult males. So there's one example where it was actually the younger ones who led the way, and the females got it before the males did. But usually, as far as I know, there isn't any gender difference.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions of Susan? Anybody else?
And I see there is another question in the chat there, right?
Okay.
Yes, indeed, that's very true about the monarch. A lot of species that are poisonous advertise that because, of course, some birds, when they're young, like blue jays, they don't know at first, but once they try a monarch, they learn very quickly, not only to avoid monarchs, but viceroys, or sometimes it generalizes just to brightly colored species in general. And so exactly, learning principles are a really important part of the whole nature-nurture complex and the whole process of evolution, which again involves everything interacting. It's just amazing in its flexibility.
Well, is there any other questions of Susan? Well, on behalf of all of our members, I want to thank you, Susan, for your presentation. Enjoyed it. Amazing. My knowledge is increased substantially. What I remember, though, is not, that's another question. So I want to thank you very much.